The morning of May 16th, 1944, near the village of Casa in Italy, a German Panzer IV emerges from behind a stone farmhouse turret rotating, searching for targets. American infantry from the 36th Division press themselves into the dirt. They have rifles, they have grenades. Against 15 tons of steel and a 75mm gun, these mean nothing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Then, from a ditch 30 meters away, a thin tube rises. A shoulder rests against it, a trigger pulls, the rocket hisses forward, trailing white smoke. It strikes the tank's side armor. The shaped charge detonates. The Panzer shudders, smoke pouring from the hatches. The crew bails out, hands raised. The American soldiers rise from cover and advance. The weapon that saved them, a bazooka, weighed just over 13 pounds and cost the United States government roughly $18 to produce. 100 kilometers to the north, British infantry from the 8th Army face a similar problem. A German Panther tank, 45 tons, 80 millimeters of frontal armor. The British soldiers carry a different weapon, 32 pounds of steel tube and spring mechanism. The PIAT, projector infantry anti-tank. They wait, 50 meters, 40, 30. The PIAT operator stands, braces the weapon, pulls the massive trigger. The bomb arcs forward at just 83 meters per second, barely faster than a man can throw a baseball. It strikes. The hollow charge penetrates. The Panther stops, disabled. But here is where the story splits. In German after-action reports, interrogation transcripts, and memoirs written after the war, a pattern emerges. When German soldiers spoke about Allied anti-tank weapons, they feared the American bazooka. They respected it. They adapted their tactics because of it. The PIAT, despite being technically comparable, despite destroying German tanks throughout the war, barely registered in their consciousness. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Why did two weapons with similar capabilities, similar kill records, produce such different psychological responses in the enemy? The answer lies not in the weapons themselves, but in everything surrounding them. The sound they made, the smoke they produced, the way they revealed or concealed their operators, the temperature of the battlefield, the reliability of their ammunition. This is not a story about which weapon was objectively better. It is a story about how soldiers, under fire, perceive threats, how those perceptions shape tactical doctrine, and how a weapon's reputation can matter as much as its penetration statistics. By the spring of 1943, every army fighting in World War II faced the same problem. Tanks had become too powerful for traditional infantry weapons. The British boys' anti-tank rifle, a massive bolt-action weapon weighing 36 pounds, could barely scratch the paint on a Panzer IV. The French had nothing effective. The Soviets relied on anti-tank rifles that worked only at suicidally close range. Infantry needed a weapon that could kill a tank without requiring a field gun or an artillery piece. Something portable. Something that could be carried by a single soldier or a two-man team. Something that would give a man in a foxhole a fighting chance when 40 tons of German steel came grinding toward his position. The Americans solved this problem first. Lieutenant Edward Ewell of the United States Army Ordnance Department had been experimenting with shaped charge grenades since 1941. The concept was elegant. A hollow charge, cone-shaped, facing the target. Upon detonation, the explosive force would concentrate into a superheated jet of gas and molten metal. This jet would punch through armor, not by brute force, but by focused energy. Temperature, pressure, physics. The problem was delivery. You could not throw a shaped charge grenade far enough. You could not mount it on a rifle. It needed propulsion. UHL designed a small rocket motor and attached it to the grenade. Now he needed a way to launch it without burning the operator alive. The story goes that Ewell was walking through an ordnance facility when he spotted a length of steel tubing, roughly 60 millimeters in diameter. The tube was just wide enough for his rocket grenade. He picked it up, held it to his shoulder, imagined the rocket firing through it. The exhaust would vent out both ends. The operator would stand behind it, aim, fire. Simple, portable, effective. In June 1942, the M1 rocket launcher was standardized. It measured 54.5 inches long. It weighed 13.2 pounds. It fired a 2.36-inch diameter rocket with a shaped charge warhead, maximum effective range, roughly 250 meters. Armor penetration, up to 100 millimeters under ideal conditions. But the real innovation was not the specifications. It was the system. The bazooka required 2 men. The gunner aimed and fired. The loader inserted the rocket from the rear, connected the electrical wire to the battery-powered ignition system. The rocket motor did not ignite until it had left the tube, reducing backblast to manageable levels. The gunner could fire from a prone position, a kneeling position, even standing if necessary. The weapon was rushed into production. By November 1942, American forces landing in North Africa during Operation Torch carried bazookas with them. The problem was that nobody had been trained to use them. General Dwight Eisenhower, on the night before the landings, was shocked to discover that his troops had never fired the weapon. Many had never even seen one. The initial combat performance was disastrous. The M6 rocket, the ammunition used by the early bazookas, suffered from catastrophic reliability problems. Fuses failed. Rockets tumbled in flight. Some detonated prematurely. Others bounced off German armor without exploding. In the Tunisian campaign, American officers searched desperately for a single confirmed instance of a bazooka actually stopping a German tank. They found none. But the Germans found the bazooka. In early 1943, during fighting near Kasserine Pass, German troops overran American positions and captured several M1 launchers and crates of rockets. These were immediately shipped back to Germany for analysis. Within months, German engineers had reverse-engineered the design, scaled it up to 88 millimeters to use existing rocket ammunition, and created the Panzer tank terror. The German response tells us something crucial. They feared the concept enough to copy it. Even though the early bazookas had failed to perform, the Germans recognized the threat, a portable shoulder-fired weapon that could penetrate armor. This changed everything. By late 1943, American ordnance officers had fixed the bazooka's problems. The M9 launcher featured improved sights, a blast shield to protect the gunner, and, most importantly, the M6A3 rocket. This new ammunition had a redesigned warhead and more reliable fusing. It worked. The M9 bazooka became the standard American infantry anti-tank weapon from 1944 onward. It was deployed to every theater. Europe, the Pacific, every infantry company received bazookas. Every soldier learned how to use one. The weapon became iconic, photographed constantly, featured in training films and propaganda. But more importantly, it worked in combat. In Normandy, bazooka teams knocked out German tanks, destroyed pillboxes, cleared strongpoints. The weapon proved effective not just against armor, but against any hardened target. A German machine gun nest in a stone building. Fire a bazooka round through the window. Problem solved. The bazooka's greatest advantage was not its penetration statistics. It was its versatility. You could use it against tanks, against bunkers, against buildings, against trucks, half-tracks, assault guns. The weapon filled a gap in infantry firepower that had existed since the beginning of the war. An infantryman, properly trained and equipped with a bazooka, could engage targets that previously required calling in artillery or tanks. The Americans produced over 476,000 bazookas during World War II. They supplied them to Allied forces through Lend-Lease. British troops used them. Free French forces used them. Soviet units received them. The weapons spread across every front where American forces fought. Now, contrast this with the British PIAT. The projector infantry anti-tank was born from desperation. By 1940, British infantry in North Africa could not stop German tanks. The Boy's anti-tank rifle was useless. The number 68 anti-tank grenade fired from a rifle was too light to damage armor. In November 1941, during Operation Crusader, British staff officers could not find a single instance of a Boy's rifle knocking out a German tank. Not one. The British needed something better. But they approached the problem differently than the Americans. Where the Americans embraced rocket propulsion, the British turned to an older technology, the spigot mortar. Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker had been experimenting with spigot mortars since before the war. The concept was simple but unusual. Instead of a barrel that contained the projectile, a spigot mortar used a fixed rod that penetrated into a hollow tail on the projectile. Blacker's original design, the Blacker Bombard, was too large for infantry use. It was a crew-served weapon, mounted on a wheeled carriage. But the concept worked. Blacker miniaturized it, creating the Baby Bombard. This caught the attention of Major Millis Jeffress, commander of Ministry of Defense 1, a secret weapons development facility nicknamed Churchill's Toy Shop. Jeffress took Blacker's design and refined it. He added a powerful spring mechanism. When cocked, the spring drove a spigot rod forward with enormous force. This spigot struck a small explosive cartridge in the tail of the bomb. The cartridge detonated, launching the bomb forward. The recoil from firing automatically reset the spring, cocking the weapon for the next shot. The result was the PIAT, 39 inches long, 32 pounds, a massive two-finger trigger on the underside, a padded shoulder stock at the rear, a trough at the front to hold the bomb, no rocket motor, no exhaust, no backblast. The weapon fired its bomb at a leisurely 83 meters per second, slower than many arrows. But the bomb carried a 3-pound-shaped charge warhead. Upon impact, this charge could penetrate 75 millimeters of armor, enough to kill any German tank if you hit the right spot. The PIAT entered production in August 1942, just 2 months after the American bazooka was standardized. The British Army issued PIATs to infantry units in early 1943. The weapon saw its first combat in Tunisia, then in Sicily during Operation Husky in July. Unlike the bazooka, the PIAT worked from the beginning. During the Sicily campaign, PIAT teams knocked out German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. The weapon proved its concept, but from the very start, soldiers hated it. The PIAT was heavy, 32 pounds, compared to the bazooka's 13. It was awkward to carry. It had no handle, no sling points. Soldiers had to cradle it in their arms or balance it on their shoulders. The ammunition was equally problematic. Each bomb weighed 3.5 pounds. A soldier carrying the PIAT and 6 bombs hauled over 50 pounds of equipment. Cocking the six weapon was a nightmare. To prepare the PIAT for its first shot, the operator had to stand on the shoulder pad, lift the entire weapon straight up using both hands, compressing the massive spring inside. This required significant strength. Shorter soldiers struggled. In combat, after the first shot, the recoil was supposed to automatically recock the weapon. But if the shot was fired at an angle, or if the target was too close, the recoil might be insufficient. Then the operator had to manually recock the PIAT while under fire. The weapon also kicked like an angry mule. The official line was that the recoil was no worse than the old boys' anti-tank rifle. This was technically true. It was also deeply unhelpful. Soldiers swore the PIAT could break your shoulder. Many refused to fire it standing. The prone position was standard. Kneel if you must. Stand only if you were insane or desperate. Range was another problem. The PIAT had an official maximum range of 750 yards when used as a mortar. Direct fire anti-tank range was listed as 115 yards. In practice, experienced operators preferred to wait until the target was within 50 yards. Some accounts describe PIAT teams waiting until 30 yards before firing. At that range, you could see the rivets on the tank's armor. You could hear the engine. You could smell the exhaust. You could absolutely see the machine gun traversing toward your position. This required courage that bordered on madness. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded to British and Commonwealth soldiers for actions involving the PIAT. These were not awards for technical proficiency. They were awards for walking toward a German tank with a 32-pound tube, waiting until you could practically touch the vehicle, then firing a bomb that moved slower than a professional baseball pitch. Accuracy was abysmal. Trials conducted in 1944 showed that a skilled operator hit a stationary tank at 100 yards only 60% of the time. One shot in three missed completely. And of the shots that hit, 25% failed to detonate due to faulty fuses. You had a 45% chance of actually damaging the target. Compare this to the bazooka. Effective range of 250 yards. Fire from twice the distance. The rocket traveled at 270 feet per second, more than 3 times faster than the PIAT bomb. The bazooka's ammunition was more reliable. By late 1943, the M6A3 rocket had a failure rate under 10%. But the PIAT had one massive advantage: no backblast. The bazooka produced a spectacular cloud of flame and smoke when fired. Every German soldier within 200 meters could see exactly where that shot came from. The bazooka team had perhaps 30 seconds to relocate before German mortars or machine guns saturated their position. The PIAT produced almost nothing. A dull thump, the bomb arcing forward, no flame, very little smoke. A PIAT team could fire from inside a building, from a basement, from a bunker, and remain concealed. The Germans would know they had been hit. They would not know where the shot came from. This advantage mattered most in defensive fighting, in urban combat, in prepared positions where the infantry planned to hold ground rather than advance. In those situations, the PIAT excelled. British troops used them extensively in the brutal house-to-house fighting in Italy. Ortona, Cassino, the Gothic Line. PIAT teams would position themselves in rubble, wait for German armor to enter kill zones, fire, then disappear into the ruins. But in offensive operations in open terrain, when infantry needed to move quickly and engage targets at range, the bazooka was superior in every measurable way. It was lighter, faster to deploy, more accurate, longer range, more reliable ammunition, easier to resupply because the rockets weighed less than half what PIAT bombs weighed. By mid-1944, both weapons were in widespread use across all theaters. American bazookas in the hands of United States troops, Canadian troops used PIATs, British troops used PIATs, the Australians in the Pacific used PIATs, which they designated PTA, Projector Infantry Tank Attack. Combat reports began accumulating. Statistics emerged. Data from the Normandy campaign showed that 7% of German tanks destroyed by British and Commonwealth forces were knocked out by PATs. This was actually better than the 6% destroyed by ground attack aircraft. The PIAT, despite all its flaws, was killing German tanks. But the American bazooka was killing more. Exact statistics are difficult to establish because American forces also used tank destroyers, towed anti-tank guns, and tanks themselves in the anti-armor role. But qualitative reports from infantry units consistently praised the bazooka. Soldiers liked it, they trusted it, they wanted more of them. A survey of Canadian Army officers in 1944 ranked infantry weapons by effectiveness. The PIAT came first. The famous Bren gun came second. This seems to contradict everything we have discussed about the weapon's flaws. But it reveals something important. In the specific tactical situations where Canadian forces employed the PIAT, defensive positions, urban combat, prepared ambushes, the weapon performed brilliantly. The question is not which weapon was better in an absolute sense. The question is which weapon the enemy feared more. And to answer that, we must look at what German soldiers said, what they wrote in reports, what they told interrogators after capture, what they remembered years later when the war was over. And here the pattern becomes clear. German soldiers feared the bazooka. They adapted tactics to counter it. They developed countermeasures specifically because of it. The PIAT, despite its combat effectiveness, barely registered as a distinct threat in German consciousness. The first clue comes from Tunisia, spring of 1943, the final battles of the North African campaign. German forces, squeezed between British 8th Army advancing from Libya and American and British forces pushing from Algeria, fought desperately to maintain their bridgehead around Tunis and Bizerti. American troops, fresh from their embarrassment at Kasserine Pass, carried the new M101 bazookas with improved M601 rockets. British troops carried the recently issued PIATs. Both weapons saw extensive combat, both killed German tanks. But the German response was dramatically different. On February 19, 1943, a German intelligence report landed on Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's desk. The subject was American rocket launchers captured near Kasserine. The report was detailed. Specifications, weight, range, penetration capability. The German analysts recognized immediately what they were looking at. A game changer. A threat serious enough to warrant immediate countermeasures. Within weeks, captured bazookas were on trains heading to Germany. Engineers at the Wehrmacht weapons testing facility in Kummersdorf stripped them down. They measured every component. They test-fired captured rockets. They analyzed the shaped charge design. They calculated armor penetration, and then they copied it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German Panzer Schreck, Raketenpanzer Buchse 54, entered production by mid-1943. It was essentially an enlarged bazooka, 88mm caliber instead of 60mm. Heavier, longer range, more powerful. But the fundamental design was lifted directly from the American weapon. Rocket propulsion, electrical ignition, shaped charge warhead. The Germans respected the bazooka enough to build their own version. Now consider the PIAT. British forces used it extensively in Tunisia. PIAT teams knocked out German tanks. German intelligence captured PIATs. They examined them, they analyzed them, and then nothing. No crash program to copy the design. No widespread tactical adaptations specifically targeting PIAT teams. The weapon appears in German documents, but always as a footnote. An afterthought. Why? The PIAT was effective. German tankers feared it when they encountered it. Fusilier Frank Jefferson knocked out 2 German tanks with a PIAT during fighting on the Gustav Line in Italy in May 1944. He received the Victoria Cross. The Germans who survived that engagement certainly remembered it. But the weapon did not spread panic through German ranks the way the bazooka did. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The answer lies in perception, in psychology, in the way human beings under extreme stress assess and prioritize threats. And to understand this, we need to examine specific combat encounters from the German perspective. Private Hans Becker, 7th Company, 10th Panzer Division, Tunisia, April 1943. His account was recorded during prisoner interrogation after his capture in May. He described an American ambush on a road near Mejez el Bab. His platoon was advancing on foot behind 2 Panzer IV tanks when the lead tank exploded. Becker saw the smoke trail, a thin, white line in the air, pointing directly back to an American position in a grove of olive trees. German infantry immediately suppressed that position with machine gun fire. The Americans relocated, but the damage was done. The Germans knew where the threat had been. They knew the Americans had rocket launchers. They knew those launchers left visible signatures. Doctrine evolved. Do not bunch up behind tanks. Watch for rocket trails. Suppress positions that reveal themselves with backblast. Contrast this with Sergeant Wilhelm Hartmann, 16th Panzer Grenadier Division, Italy, October 1943. During fighting near the Volturno River, Hartmann's squad was supporting a Panzer IV as it moved through the ruins of a destroyed village. The tank was hit. The shaped charge penetrated the side armor. The crew bailed out. Hartmann and his men searched for the enemy position. They found nothing. No smoke, no flash, no indication of where the shot originated. The British PIAT team had fired from inside a collapsed building. The bomb traveled slowly enough that there was no visible trail. The sound was muffled by the surrounding ruins. By the time Hartmann's men began searching, the PIAT team had moved to a different position. They fired again. Another German vehicle hit. Still no clear indication of the firing point. Hartmann survived the war. In a 1952 interview, he recalled that engagement. He remembered British anti-tank weapons. He remembered that they were dangerous, but he could not recall the specific name. He referred to them as the British mortar thing, not the PIAT, not even those damned PIATs, or any phrase indicating specific recognition. Just a vague memory of something that fired slowly and hit hard. This pattern repeats across German accounts. When German soldiers talked about American infantry anti-tank weapons, they used the word Panzer. But that was their own weapon. When pressed, they would clarify. The American Panzer, the thin tube, the one that shoots fire. The bazooka. They knew what it was. They remembered it vividly, the sound, the smoke, the danger. When asked about British anti-tank weapons, German veterans would mention tanks, anti-tank guns, artillery. Occasionally someone would remember a spring-loaded projector or a weapon that fired bombs slowly. Descriptions were vague. Recognition was poor. The PIAT simply had not imprinted itself on German tactical consciousness the way the bazooka had. Part of this was operational tempo. American forces, particularly after 1944, fought aggressively. They advanced, they attacked, they used bazookas in offensive operations. A bazooka team advancing across a field, suppressing a German position, moving forward. That created a psychological impact. The weapon became associated with American infantry aggression. British and Canadian forces used PIATs more defensively. They established positions. They waited. They ambushed. This was effective tactically. It killed German tanks, but it did not create the same psychological footprint. A weapon you never see that strikes from concealment and disappears is terrifying in the moment, but it does not create lasting fear because there is no visual memory attached to it. The bazooka announced itself. Every time it fired, every German within visual range saw the backblast, saw the smoke trail, saw exactly where American infantry had positioned themselves. This visibility created familiarity, and familiarity, paradoxically, created fear. German soldiers learned to recognize the bazooka, to watch for it, to adjust tactics around it. The weapon became a known threat, and known threats occupy mental space. The PIAT, by remaining concealed, never achieved that recognition. It was simply one of many British weapons that could kill a tank. Germans feared British anti-tank guns, they feared British tanks, they feared being hit by something from a ruin or a tree line. But the specific weapon, the PIAT itself, never became a distinct element in their threat assessment. There was also the question of reliability. The early bazooka rockets had terrible reliability. Germans captured them, tested them, and discovered that many failed to detonate. But by late 1943, American ordnance had fixed the problems. The M6A3 rocket worked. German intelligence noted this improvement. Reports circulated. The American rocket launcher had become reliable. Threat assessment increased accordingly. The PIAT never underwent that same evolution in German perception. Early PIAT ammunition had reliability problems, 25% failure rate on fuses. Germans who encountered PIATs in Sicily or early Italy might have seen bombs bounce off their tanks without detonating. This created an impression. British weapon, unreliable, not as dangerous as other threats. By 1944, British ordnance had improved PIAT ammunition. The Mark I bomb had much better fusing. Reliability improved dramatically. But German intelligence either did not notice or did not disseminate this information widely. The perception of the PIAT as unreliable persisted in German tactical thought even as the weapon became increasingly effective in British hands. Temperature played a role. The bazooka used battery-powered electrical ignition. In extreme cold, batteries failed. This was a significant problem on the Eastern Front and during the Battle of the Bulge. German soldiers, fighting in winter conditions, discovered that American bazookas sometimes malfunctioned in freezing weather. This was noted, documented, circulated in tactical bulletins. But the same reports also noted that in normal temperatures, the bazooka worked consistently. And more importantly, the Americans had so many of them that even a 20% failure rate due to cold still meant an overwhelming number of functional weapons on the battlefield. The sheer quantity of bazookas, combined with American industrial capacity to replace failed batteries, meant the weapon remained a persistent threat regardless of weather. The PIAT used a mechanical spring and percussion ignition. No batteries. Temperature did not affect its function. This should have made it more reliable than the bazooka in extreme conditions. But German soldiers on the Eastern Front rarely encountered PIATs. The weapon was primarily used by Western allies. So this advantage, which could have enhanced the PIAT's reputation, never factored into German threat assessment. There was also the matter of sound. The bazooka produced a distinctive crack when fired, the rocket motor ignition, the whoosh of the projectile in flight. German veterans remembered this sound decades later. Some described it as similar to incoming mortar fire but shorter in duration. Others compared it to a large firework. The sound was memorable, distinctive, easy to recall. The PIAT made almost no sound. The spring release was muffled. The bomb traveled subsonically. There was a dull thump on impact, but that could be mistaken for any number of battlefield noises, a mortar landing, a grenade, artillery. The lack of a distinctive audio signature meant the PIAT did not create auditory memories in German soldiers. It was just one more explosion in an environment full of explosions. Ammunition logistics revealed another difference. Bazooka rockets weighed 3.5 pounds each. A soldier could carry 6 rockets, roughly 21 pounds, without being overburdened. American supply doctrine ensured constant resupply. Ammunition dumps near the front, trucks bringing rockets forward. The ubiquity of bazooka ammunition meant German soldiers encountered it constantly. Captured supply dumps, dead American soldiers with rockets still in their packs. The physical presence of the ammunition reinforced awareness of the weapon. PIAT bombs weighed 3.5 pounds each, same as bazooka rockets, but the PIAT itself weighed 32 pounds compared to the bazooka's 13. A PIAT team carried less ammunition because the launcher itself consumed so much weight. British supply doctrine was less generous than American. Ammunition was conserved. PIAT teams operated with smaller loadouts. Germans who overran British positions found fewer PIAT bombs than they found bazooka rockets in American positions. Less physical evidence meant less psychological impact. Training intensity mattered. American doctrine mandated bazooka training for every infantry soldier, not just designated teams. Everyone learned the basics: load, aim, fire, clear backblast area. This meant American infantry used bazookas aggressively and frequently. Every platoon had multiple soldiers capable of employing the weapon. Flexibility, redundancy. If the designated bazooka team was killed, someone else could pick up the weapon and continue engaging targets. British training was more specialized. PIAT operation required significant physical strength. Not every soldier could cock the weapon. British doctrine assigned PIATs to specific teams. These teams trained extensively. They became very proficient. But if that team was killed, the weapon might sit unused because nearby soldiers lacked the training or the strength to operate it. Less overall usage meant less visibility on the battlefield. German tactical adaptations reveal the disparity in threat perception. By mid-1944, German armor units implemented specific countermeasures against rocket launchers. Schürzen, armored skirts mounted on the sides of tanks. These thin metal plates were designed to defeat shaped charge warheads by causing them to detonate prematurely before the jet could form properly. The Germans added Schürzen primarily because of the bazooka and their own Panzer. The threat of portable rocket launchers had become so significant that tank production was modified to counter it. Panzer IVs received Schürzen, Panthers received them, even some assault guns were retrofitted. This was a massive industrial effort. Thousands of tons of steel, hundreds of thousands of man-hours, all because German high command feared rocket launchers. But when you examine German training documents and tactical manuals from 1944 and 1945, the threat described is almost always the Panzer or the American bazooka. The PIAT is mentioned occasionally, usually in a list of Allied anti-tank weapons, but not singled out for special attention. The weapon that had killed hundreds of German tanks in Italy and Northwest Europe was not considered significant enough to warrant dedicated countermeasures. By late 1944, the tactical landscape had evolved. American and British forces were advancing into Germany. German armor was increasingly scarce. Fuel shortages, production bottlenecks, Allied air superiority destroying tanks before they reached the front. Infantry anti-tank weapons became less relevant because there were fewer tanks to destroy. But the psychological patterns established earlier persisted. German defenders in the Rhineland, in the Ruhr, in Bavaria, these soldiers had grown up hearing about American bazookas. Propaganda mentioned them. Training emphasized them. Veterans warned about them. The weapon had achieved mythological status. A GI with a bazooka was a serious threat. Approach American infantry carefully. Watch for backblast. Do not expose your tank to close-range ambush. British PIATs killed German tanks throughout this period. The Canadians used them extensively in the Netherlands. British Second Army used them in the Rhineland, but German defenders did not fear the PIAT specifically. They feared British anti-tank capabilities generally. The distinction matters. A generalized fear of British anti-tank weapons spreads attention across multiple systems: tanks, guns, unknown weapons in ruins. A specific fear of American bazookas focuses threat assessment on a single recognizable system. Post-war interviews with German veterans reinforce this pattern. Obergefreiter Ernst Bauer, 1st Panzer Division, interviewed in 1963. He fought from Normandy to the Ruhr. When asked about anti-tank weapons, he immediately mentioned Panzerfausts, German disposable launchers. Then, American bazookas. You could see them coming, white smoke in the air. If you saw that, you knew Americans were close. You buttoned up, you moved. You did not stay still. The interviewer asked about British anti-tank weapons. Bauer paused. They had tanks, good tanks, and guns, big guns that could kill a tiger from a kilometer away. Their infantry, I don't remember. Maybe mortars. We were more worried about their tanks. The interviewer pressed. Did British infantry have portable anti-tank weapons? Bauer thought. Maybe, I think so, but I don't remember them. The Americans? Yes. The British? I remember their tanks. This was not an isolated case. Dozens of similar interviews, German veterans who fought against both American and British forces, they remembered American bazookas vividly. They remembered British tanks, British artillery, British air power. They rarely remembered PIATs specifically. There is one exception to this pattern. German paratroopers who fought at Arnhem in September 1944 during Operation Market Garden. British 1st Airborne Division dropped into the Netherlands and held the bridge at Arnhem for 9 days against overwhelming German counterattacks. During this battle, British paratroopers used PIATs extensively. Major Robert Kane of the 2nd South Staffordshire Regiment destroyed multiple German armoured vehicles with his PIAT. He received the Victoria Cross. German 9th SS Panzer Division, which led the counterattack, encountered PIAT fire repeatedly throughout the battle. In post-war accounts by German officers who fought at Arnhem, the PIAT is mentioned frequently. They remembered it, they described it, they even grudgingly respected it. But Arnhem was unusual. The battle was concentrated. Urban terrain, close range, extended duration. British paratroopers fought from fixed positions, exactly the scenario where the PIAT excelled. German units at Arnhem gained intimate familiarity with the weapon through repeated exposure under desperate circumstances. That created lasting memories. Everywhere else, the pattern held. The bazooka was visible, memorable, feared. The PIAT was effective but anonymous. It killed tanks without claiming credit. It destroyed German vehicles and then disappeared back into ruins or tree lines. Effective tactically, invisible psychologically. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Allied armies crossed the Rhine, encircled the Ruhr, drove toward Berlin from both west and east. Infantry anti-tank weapons played smaller roles. German armor was nearly extinct. The last Tiger tanks, the last Panthers, burning in ditches or abandoned for lack of fuel. American infantry still carried bazookas. They used them against strongpoints, against buildings, against any hardened target that needed to be cracked open. The weapon had proven so versatile that it remained standard issue long after tanks disappeared from the battlefield. British infantry still carried PIATs. They used them the same way, against buildings, against pillboxes, against anything that needed a shaped charge to penetrate. But British tactical doctrine was already planning to replace the PIAT. The weapon worked, but soldiers hated it. Too heavy, too awkward, too difficult to cock. Post-war, The British Army would adopt the American M20 Super Bazooka, a larger, more powerful version of the weapon they had watched Americans use throughout the war. The final tally of tanks destroyed is impossible to calculate precisely. Combat records are incomplete. Tank losses were attributed to multiple causes. Direct fire from anti-tank guns, artillery, airstrikes, mines, friendly fire, mechanical breakdown. The fog of war makes exact statistics impossible. But qualitative assessments are clear. Both the Bazooka and the PIAT killed German tanks throughout World War II. Both weapons were effective when used properly. Both gave infantry a fighting chance against armor. The PIAT actually had slightly better armor penetration than the 2.36-inch bazooka. With 775 to 100 millimeters for the PIAT versus 76 millimeters for the early bazooka. The critical difference was not capability, it was perception. The bazooka terrified German soldiers because they could see it, the backblast, the smoke trail, the visible threat. Every time a bazooka fired, it announced American infantry. It declared aggression. It showed where the enemy was. That visibility, paradoxically, made it more feared than the quieter, more concealed PIAT. German soldiers adapted their tactics around the bazooka. They trained to counter it. They developed armor modifications to defeat it. They copied it and built their own version. The weapon became part of German tactical consciousness. A recognized, named, specific threat. The PIAT remained a shadow. Effective but unknown. Deadly but anonymous. It killed German tanks from concealment and left no trace. This made it tactically superior in defensive operations. But it also meant German soldiers never developed specific recognition of the weapon. It was just another British anti-tank system in a war full of British anti-tank systems. The psychological lesson here extends beyond these two weapons. In warfare, perception matters as much as reality. A weapon that announces itself, that creates visual and auditory signatures, that forces the enemy to acknowledge its presence, this weapon achieves psychological dominance, regardless of its actual effectiveness. It occupies mental space. It shapes tactics. It creates fear. A weapon that remains concealed, that strikes without warning, that disappears after firing. This weapon is tactically effective, but psychologically invisible. It kills without claiming credit. It works without recognition. Effective but forgotten. The American bazooka was both. It was effective, and it made sure everyone knew it. The smoke, the backblast, the distinctive sound, the ubiquity of the weapon across American forces. Every German soldier who fought against Americans learned to watch for bazookas, learned to fear them, learned to adapt. The British PIAT was effective in silence. It asked for no recognition. It claimed no glory. It simply did its job, killed tanks, protected infantry, held positions, and when the war ended, it faded from memory, even among the enemies it had defeated. 6 Victoria Crosses, hundreds of German tanks destroyed, 7% of all German armor losses in Normandy. These statistics prove the PIAT worked, but statistics do not create fear. Visibility creates fear. Sound creates fear. Recognition creates fear. The Germans feared the American bazooka because they could not ignore it. The weapon forced itself into their consciousness with every shot. White smoke, loud report, visible operators, constant presence. The bazooka demanded to be feared. The PIAT asked for nothing and received nothing. Not recognition, not fame, not psychological dominance, just quiet effectiveness in the hands of soldiers brave enough to wait until 30 yards before pulling the trigger. That courage deserves recognition that history has largely withheld. The men who carried PIATs, who humped 32 pounds of steel and spring mechanism through Italian mountains and French hedgerows, who stood on the shoulder pad and lifted the entire weapon to cock it one more time, who waited in ruins for German armor to close within killing range. They won their battles without the weapon that made them famous. The bazooka made American infantry famous. Newsreels featured it. Propaganda celebrated it. Soldiers came home and told stories about the rocket launcher that stopped German tanks. The weapon and the soldiers who used it achieved mythic status. The PIAT gave British and Canadian infantry a tool, nothing more, nothing less. The soldiers who used it were not famous for their weapon. They were famous, when they were famous at all, for their individual courage. Frank Jefferson, Robert Kane, Ernest Smith, Ganju Lama, these men received medals for their actions. The weapon they used was a... Footnote. In 1951, the British Army officially replaced the PIAT with the American M20 Super Bazooka. By 1956, the PIAT was declared obsolete. The weapon that had served through the last 3 years of World War II, that had killed hundreds of German tanks, that had protected British infantry through Sicily, Italy, Normandy, the Netherlands and Germany itself, this weapon was quietly retired. No ceremony, no recognition. It simply disappeared from service. And the bazooka continued. The M20 Super Bazooka served through Korea, through Vietnam, through conflicts in the Middle East and Latin America. The basic concept, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher with a shaped charge warhead, this concept defined infantry anti-tank weapons for the next 50 years. Descendants of the bazooka are still in service today. The RPG-7, the AT-4, the Javelin, all inherit the bazooka's fundamental approach. Portable, rocket-propelled, shape charge, announce yourself, accept the backblast, trade concealment for range and speed. The PIAT's approach, spring-loaded spigot mortar, no backblast, short range, slow projectile. This approach died with the weapon. No modern army uses anything like it. The tactical advantages were real but insufficient. Concealment without the backblast, use in enclosed spaces. These benefits could not overcome the disadvantages. Weight, awkwardness, short range, poor accuracy. The market chose. Armies worldwide adopted bazooka-type weapons. Nobody copied the PIAT. This was the final verdict. Not from German soldiers who feared the bazooka more, but from military professionals evaluating which system worked better overall. The answer was clear. But for the men who carried the PIAT into battle, who learned to love or at least tolerate the weapon, despite its flaws, the question of which weapon was better was irrelevant. They used what they were issued. They learned to use it well. They killed German tanks. They survived. That was enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.